Good afternoon and welcome back to Have We Got Planning News for You? And I remind you, first of all, as always, to consider making a charity donation in lieu of a registration fee. The charities we support are listed on our website, havewegotplanningNewsForYou.com. Or, of course, please consider making a donation to a local charity of your choice. We are delighted this evening to welcome as our special guest the Planning Inspectorate Head of Local Plans, Simon Berkeley. Simon, good evening.
Delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
We're delighted to have you. Usual questions. Where are you calling from? What are you chosen as our theme? And what are anything you drink and see?
Okay, well, actually, in one way or another, those things are all kind of, at least, linked. So I am in Yorkshire, where I live near Home Firth. So yes, I'll go with my theme first. So my theme is Wallace and Gromit, by and large, or at least in part, because Wallace and Gromit kind of mirrors my life in some ways, anyway. Not all aspects of my life. I should sort of hasten to add. No, well, I do make packing toast as it happens, but that's sort of by the by. And I also don't have a side hustle as a madcap inventor. But Wallace and Gromit, as you will know, is made by Aardman Animations in Bristol. And as it happens, I grew up in the West Country, not far from Bristol. And of course, the Planning Inspectorate's HQ is indeed in Bristol itself. So that's one thing. Also, and you may or may not know this, but Wallace and Gromit apparently live in Lancashire. Wigan, I believe. But Wallace, rather controversially, has a Yorkshire accent, and more specifically, a Home Firth / Home Valley accent. And that's precisely where I live and where I'm calling from today. So there you go. And before you ask, no, I can't do a Yorkshire accent.
Paul got very excited because you mentioned Yorkshire and Lancashire in the same breath. No. Well, sorry, we're really happy to have you on the show. Obviously, your Fiefs of Local Plans hugely topical at the moment, and Chris is looking forward to leading the interview with you later on. I should say, I very upsettingly have to go to a memorial service at 6, so I'm going to have to duck out before the interview. So I'm looking forward to watching that later on YouTube. So I'll leave you in Chris and the team's capable hands. Meanwhile, let's go to the team and. As always, Mary, how are you? You're in Cornwall, aren't you?
I'm in Cornwall. I've got my crackers. I've got my bit of yarg. You can't buy Wensleydale. You won't be surprised. That was my appalling attempt at an accent. But you can't buy Wensleydale, which, by the way, I love in Cornwall. And I shall be drinking my Padstow gin later.
Superb, Mary. Great to see you.
I didn't mention, and probably should have, that I have nothing less than a large mug of Yorkshire tea. What else could I need to find myself through this ordeal?
Indeed. Ordeal. Paul.
Hello, Charlie.
Twice now. How are you doing?
Absolutely. Well, I have to say, I thought I'd done well by having the studios of Aardman Animation in Bristol, directly behind me. But I've got to defer to Sasha, who has actually come looking like Wallace. So cheers, Sash. That's very impressive. And in terms of the Yorkshire accent, of course, the Yorkshire accent was mouthed by the great Peter Sallis, who was from Home Firth, who did the voice of Wallace. So I tip my hat to you. And in terms of what I'm drinking, this is a bit obscure, but I'm drinking a beer called 42, which because there is a link between Douglas Adams and Aardman Animation, because on Douglas Adams' death, when they had the memorial event for him, Aardman Animations did Douglas the Rhino as a plasticine figure, which was then auctioned for charity. And I tried to put that on the back, but apparently copyrights and all sorts of nonsense stopped me from doing so. But look it up on the internet, it's excellent. So cheers, I have the meaning of life. Hey, perfect.
Here we are. Great fruit beer, Paul, rather than you than me. That's what I'd say.
It's repulsive.
In a shock mood. Sasha, how are you doing?
Hello, good afternoon, Charlie. Very well, thank you. I'm in town, central London, and I am like Simon Great Minds. I'm also having a cup of Yorkshire tea. And I, as Paul says, I don't have any accessory for, as Paul has termed me, Wallace. I'm quite happy to adopt that and accept that. I think it's a reference, a not very subtle reference, but a reference to my very extensive hairstyle.
No comments. Great to see you, Sasha. And last but not least, Chris.
Well, actually, Sasha, it was discovered in the latter films that actually Wallace had an amazing, fantastic hair when he was younger and great big moustache and sideburns, which we've seen photographs of the younger Sasha looking absolutely dashing with a fine head of hair. So I think it's an entirely appropriate reference, which was complimentary on every level. I am at home in Hogwarts. I've had an inquiry go short. We like that, don't we? But 3 High Court cases to deal with in the paperwork. My wife bought me at Christmas a cheese-making kit, so that definitely makes me very like Wallace. And we're always making gadgets here. Look at this, is for taking the top off a beer top. And obviously, there's the house, which is a contraption that was lots of fun. There's the frame to it. Over here, I've got, obviously, Presumption, a very frightening-looking rabbit. And because it's so terribly English, then I've got a terribly English beer. Shin kickers. In my part of the world, Gloucestershire, you see that. We have a shin-kicking competition at Chipping Cowden, where we used to live. And so I just love Wallace and Gromit. It's so English. But then, Simon, so are you.
Yeah. Fantastic, Chris. Great stuff. Well, let's crack on with our first half of the show. As I say to all our guests, Simon, no obligation to comment, but equally, if there's anything that we talk about in the first half of the show that grabs your interest and you'd like to comment on, feel free to do so.
I'm happy to intervene.
Well, I'm going to start off with the news update, first of all. And of course, the big news is that there's a general election on the 4th of July. And what does that mean for planning? It means quite a few things. It means, firstly, that any applications or appeals currently in the system may be affected by any early changes in policy or law by whoever forms the next government. I think people are working on the basis that it might be the end of the year by the time the next government's, whoever they may be formed by, the next government's planning policies would be in place, but it looks like it might be a bit sooner. If it's Labour who win the election, we also know that there are 6 pledges about their first actions as they win the election, which were announced this week, don't mention housing or planning. So query, might that be in the second wave of things they do if they are to be elected? Angela Rayner has, however, announced that if elected, Labour will, within the first 12 months, publish a list of 12 locations for new towns. There's an original idea. And keep an eye out for manifestos, which are likely to be imminent. I, for one, will be turning straight to the bits about planning and housing for all the various manifestos that are due to be published shortly. What's going to happen to the consultation on brownfield development, which is closed? People are expecting changes to the MPPF later this summer. What about the National Development Management Policies? Well, certainly it doesn't seem like they're going to happen this side of the election, and it remains to be seen whether they're taken forward afterwards. And lastly, on a different note, and perhaps closer to home for you, Simon, after much toing and froing over housing need and the consequent requirement figures, the Purbeck District Council, now part of Dorset Council, their local plan has finally been found sound no less than 5 years after being submitted for examination. Is that a record in the recent era? Well, it should be. It might not be, sadly. It says it all.
It might be close, Charlie, but yes. I'm not sure this is a record.
Close but no cigar. Anyway, that might be something we come back to later on in the show when Chris has our discussion. So we'll park that one there. Now, Sasha, without further ado, you're going to tell us about a DCO, Junction 9.
I am. I absolutely am. I thought Chris was going to pay honour to my case by showing us his backside, but in fact he's picking up the rabbit. Is it a rabbit or is it a cat? It's a rabbit, isn't it?
It's a were-rabbit.
Yeah. Very appropriate for, yeah. Don't show Gromit that, whatever you do. Right. I'm going to deal with a DCO. Interesting. A DCO that was subject to examination in 2023. And this involves a significant expansion of Junction 9 of the M3, which all of us will have taken down the road. And the two examining inspectors were Wendy Mackay and Matthew Sims. And as we see, the report's very fresh off the stock. 16th of May, the Secretary of State's report into it, and that won't surprise many people who are familiar with the development consent order, that the Secretary of State effectively granted the order and the ancillary compulsory purchase required for that. And now I think what I want is obviously promoted by National Highways, as you can see. Interesting case because it was also supported by Hampshire and Winchester. And what is also interesting about it, that half the land required for the development consent order fell within the South Downs National Park. So not the easiest in a sense, because of course there was a need to consider the statutory duty to have regard to conserving the beauty of the national park. And I noticed actually on the news item, Charlie, we might cover it, that a refusal of a car park in the Lake District on that very ground in the past couple of days. But no, so there's the compelling need argued by National Highways for the expansion of the junction to improve the capacity, as is often the case, balanced against the national park. But the thing I really wanted to note for our viewers was, I think there's a very interesting point here, that the examining inspectors took the view that the issue of emissions was neutral in the balance, but the Secretary of State disagreed and actually gave it limited negative weight. And it's quite interesting. I think it is noteworthy that in 2024, the issue of emissions is only given limited negative weight in the current policy climate that we live in. But the fundamental thing is the benefits, not unsurprisingly, were taken the view that the reduction in congestion and delays, and also the safety improvements and the support for economic growth were such as to outweigh the harms that were identified in relation to heritage assets, the emissions that I've already mentioned, and obviously the landscape and visual impacts of expanding the junction and the surrounding network. So that is the DCO, Charlie. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha. Sounds interesting about emissions, and as you say, limited weight seems somewhat eyebrow-raising to emissions in the current climate, no pun intended. Now, Paul, you're going to take us to Oxfordshire and Chesterton, Cherwell District Council, somewhere that you and I know quite well.
Just a touch before I do, as I understand it, the record for the longest local planning inquiry went to Leeds UDP, which took 12 years, and the shortest one went to the Northumberland National Park local plan inquiry, which I did, which was 38 minutes. And I view that as being something that's going to take an awful lot of So I'm going to tell you about a case in Chesterton. It's a decision of Mr. Inspector Sturgis from the 15th of May, an appeal by weight against the decision of Cherwell District Council. Most of the ones that I seem to do on this show seem to be non-determination appeals, but this one was an actual decision dating back to July 2023, relating to outline permission for up to 147 homes on land south of Green Lane, Chesterton. Somebody called Banner was involved in it, but happily they stripped him of all of his honours in relation to the appearances. His lordships has gone. He's been stripped of his letters patent. He's just Charles Banner on the end. So I don't know who he might be. So it's a site which isn't allocated or wasn't allocated and lies outside the settlement limits. There were three main issues: locational appropriateness given facilities in the village, effect on character and appearance, and whether or not it was a proportionate extension to the village, and whether it closed a gap between Little Chesterton and Chesterton itself. Those are not interesting issues which have any widespread application elsewhere. So I'm going to skirt merrily across in relation to those. Suffice to say that those issues were essentially resolved in favour of the appellants. So it was sufficiently provided for with facilities, etc. But this is the interesting thing, the policy context. Because despite it not being allocated in the local plan and outside the built confines of the village, it was concluded that the development was in compliance with the development plan. Now, it may be that this is just the inspector giving up because his head hurt in relation to this, because I know mine did when I did a 5-year land supply or 4-year land supply argument in Cherwell before Christmas. But the inspector didn't have to grapple with the issue about housing need and whether it's a 4-year or a 5-year supply in Cherwell, because the inspector found compliance with the development plan. Now, how does a site which is not allocated and lies outside the settlement limits find compliance with the development plan? Well, there is a very old bit of the development plan in Cherwell which identifies that development outside of the settlement, sporadic development outside settlements, is contrary to, I think it's policy C8. But that's a very old part of the policy of the development plan. There are more up-to-date parts of the development plan, which are policies PV1 and PV2 for the geeks who may be watching, which says that a certain proportion of Cherwell's housing need is to be directed towards Category A villages, provided that they're capable of being expanded and provided they meet the criteria of policy PV2. So although this is a non-allocated site outside the confines of the settlement, the inspector found there was compliance with PV2, and because of the approach that's taken strategically with the overall strategy of the plan, that there was compliance with the development plan overall. So it's an interesting case, and it may be, I don't know, affected by the decision I was involved in, which is the Hayford Park case, which is currently before the courts, where the challenge is in relation to 5-year land supply, or rather 4-year land supply, and the development plan is in 2 parts, one of which relates to Oxford's needs, one of which is Cherwell's needs, and should you aggregate them or disaggregate them? And guess what? MPPF and PPG don't tell you. So it's interesting, but happily, some bloke called Banner managed to convince the inspector that he didn't need to go there because of the issue of compliance with the development plan overall. So it's an interesting outcome. And Charlie, frankly, your relative, this Banner bloke, is somebody you could learn from. So, sorry to see you departing partway through the show.
Cheers, Paul. Thanks very much. Now, without further ado, Mary, we go from Yorkshire to Durham.
Yes, and not wholly dissimilar, but a very different result. So this is a decision by Inspector George Baird, and we all know that there's an inspector who knows his own mind. It related to an appeal by Bellway Homes against a refusal by Durham County Council last June in 2023 to grant permission, as you can see, for 148 dwellings on a greenfield site, 2 fields split by a public right-of-way outside Great Lumley, a village. And first of all, on a practical note, as you might expect from this inspector, he was perfectly prepared to allow amended plans to be submitted. Those plans were necessary because after the determination by the council, a new SPD was introduced, which meant that there weren't enough car parking spaces. And so amendments were allowed to facilitate that. And the main issues were 2 main issues, one related to landscape and visual impact, and the second, whether development would constitute sustainable development. There was a local plan from 2020, the County Durham plan, and the site was agreed to be in the open countryside outside the settlement of Great Lumley. And the plan promoted a dispersed pattern of development, principally focused on the major towns that have the greatest opportunities for employment services and facilities. But there was a particular policy, Policy 6, which allowed development on unallocated sites subject to satisfying specific criteria. And the one I'm going to focus on is the one that proved to be fatal, which is that the site had to have good access by sustainable modes of transport to relevant services and facilities, and it had to reflect the size of the settlement. Now, on the first issue, landscape and visual harm, the inspector concluded that in the round, although the scheme would result in highly localised, minor, moderate adverse effects, with mitigation, the development would not result in a materially unacceptable landscape and visual harm. So the appellant won that argument. But with regard to matter 2, there was a lot of detail about the sustainability issue, and the inspector noted that there would be 3 routes to the facilities and services in the village. He was satisfied that those 3 routes would not be unsafe. They wouldn't deter their use. They weren't unattractive. They weren't particularly difficult. he was focused on distances, and he was taken to the CIHT guidelines, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, the 500 meters, 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters being the desirable, acceptable and preferred maximum distances for commuting in schools, and then the 400, 800 and 1,200 distances to facilities and services. And he was also referred to manual for streets and the 2 kilometre maximum distance there, likely to be most successful in getting a transfer of journeys from cars to foot or cycling. But he took the view, and he specifically referred to the 2021 National Design Guide and the 800-metre walkable local neighbourhood. He took the view that that was a more appropriate distance than any of the others that I have mentioned. And secondly, he took the view that just drawing an 800-metre radius, which obviously some of the witnesses had done, was not the point. The point was you take a midpoint from your clusters of housing development and you ask yourself, are they 800 metres or so from these facilities? And he took the view that there weren't enough facilities within that 800-metre distance. There was really only one, and that was the primary school. Pretty important one, but not enough. And other distances involved to the post office, to an infant school, to a pharmacy, to a grocer's shop, to a community centre. I mean, this wasn't a village without facilities. It was a 14 or 15-minute walk. So he wasn't overly impressed with that. But the thing that I think also really was impossible for them to overcome was buses, access to buses. And although they had some bus stops within 390 to 450 metres, they were served by an hourly service. There were some other stops further away, but they were served by twice hourly services. But he placed quite a lot of store on the fact that none of those services would take you to higher order Newcastle or Durham, where most of the jobs, leisure facilities, higher order shopping services were. And so he came to the conclusion that it was not actually a sustainable location. And for that reason, he came to the view that the proposals would not accord with the local plan. It was contrary to the development plan. And although he gave very significant weight to the provision of housing, and Durham had a 4-year supply, but he gave very significant weight to the market and the affordable housing, he nevertheless didn't find that there was anything that warranted a decision other than in accordance with the development plan. And there's one particular paragraph I want to mention, which is just before his final overall conclusion. He said, I need to acknowledge the significant concessions that were made by the local planning authority witnesses, which I acknowledge were the result of cogent questioning by the appellant, and I have not ignored them. I have used my own judgment based on my own professional experience and the relevant policies of the development plan. So that's code for Mohammed Hashi, acting for the appellant, obviously secured some great concessions in cross-examination, but George wasn't making his decision on the basis of those concessions. He was making his decision on the basis of his own expertise. And after all, that is the very special thing about planning appeals, which sometimes everyone forgets. Our inspectors are experts and they do exercise their own planning judgment. And it's a tragedy when you've secured those concessions and you think you've won the inquiry, that it turns out you haven't, because the inspector's making up his or her own mind. So there ended the lesson.
We've all been there.
So commiserations.
Show from it. So yes, commiserations to whoever, or Hachi, who was involved in that. Now, that's fascinating. Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to open our interview with Simon, and I will quietly bow out in a couple of minutes to head to this memorial service, but look forward to catching up later, and great to see you, Simon.
See you too, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I have to say, for Hashi, I know he was frustrated about that decision, but frankly, as an advocate, there is nothing more you can do. I mean, he obviously did phenomenally well, and what more can you do if the inspector's against you on their own judgment? Anyway, moving on. Simon, thank you very much for joining us. We feel extremely lucky and fortunate to have you on the show because you head up the Inspectorate's very significant work in relation to local plans. And of course, it is a plan-led system. So this is the heart of the system. And here we are getting an opportunity to talk to you at a time when, as the post made clear on LinkedIn, it's a time of great flux. We've got a very difficult situation currently, and then we're moving to a new system. And so the first question I wanted to ask really was, over the last 2 years, we've had something like 60 local plans that have been paused or abandoned. And what effect has that had on the administration of local plan work for the Inspectorate?
Yeah, that's right. We have had a good number of local plans paused and or, eventually abandoned, for a whole variety of reasons, I suppose, including within that authorities that have been waiting for the outcome of the now current MPPF. So look, it's always difficult for us, frankly, when something like that goes awry, whether that's, when plans aren't submitted when the local authority thought it would be, or when examinations are held up, or when plans are withdrawn. And, in all those sorts of scenarios, we find ourselves ultimately with an inspector who had planned to be working on an examination, but then finds that he or she isn't. So what that means for us, then in practical terms, is looking at how best to deploy the inspector affected. Now, that will depend on the precise scenario, I have to say. That may well mean the inspector taking on some appeal casework or some other sort of casework, perhaps doing written reps appeals, or perhaps a hearing or two to fill the gap if it is indeed, a pause, for example, that we're talking about. Or you never know, it might just mean redeploying the inspector to another local plan examination. I don't know if people know this, but a good number of inspectors will be examining more than one local plan at any one time. So overall, in short and in a nutshell, I suppose, it has the effect of causing us some extra work to try to optimise the use of inspector time.
Yeah, I mean, it has been particularly difficult, hasn't it? I was, in December last year, I was at the Dover local plan, and it was the only one sitting at the time. I mean, you would expect about 30 of them to be sitting at one time. Going forward, obviously, you've got some plans that are taking place now, but we're also moving to a new system. The LURA has introduced a new system, albeit in a skeletal form through primary legislation. Has PINS been involved in that? Have they been involved in creating the new system?
Well, depends what you mean by creating, I suppose. So to be absolutely clear to anyone out there watching that might be unsure, so PINS doesn't actually in and of itself create any part of the planning system. So, I haven't been sitting here in my house drawing up the LURA or regulations or anything else that is yet to come our way. So it's for colleagues in DLUC, the department, to draw up options for ministers based on what ministers are looking to achieve. And ultimately, it's for ministers to decide what any new system might look like. Having said that, we, PINS that is, are, if I can put it this way, the sort of implementation arm of government in that respect. So what that means is that we have that real kind of practical, hands-on experience and insight to bring to the table about how, for example, different policy options might actually play out in reality on the ground, through plan making itself, and then through examinations as well. So we, myself, that is, and a few very, very lucky colleagues have been working very closely with colleagues in DLUC to help them look at things through the implementation lens, if I might put it that way to you. So yes, we have been involved in that capacity in relation to the LURA, and we will continue to be involved as well with regards to the regulation needed to bring the new system into force, and we'll also continue to be involved in that sort of capacity in relation to other aspects as well. So, for example, like working out the detail of how local plan gateways, what the local plan gateways process might be, just as one example, but also in relation to, this was mentioned earlier by Charlie, I think, the NDMPs, the new national policy or whatever it's going to be called about plan making that will sit by the side of NDMPs, and indeed new PPG that will be needed to come along behind that and support all of that new policy as well. So yeah, so absolutely, we have been and will remain involved. Do you know what? Hopefully that will be slightly reassuring to some out there that we do have that kind of involvement and are able to sort of advise DLUC colleagues in relation to the practical application of policy. So as I say, our involvement really is one of helping, sometimes influencing, but we don't make decisions, and it's up to DLUC colleagues, frankly, whether they take our suggestions forward or not. And even if they do, the buck ultimately sort of rests with ministers.
Yeah, well, it is reassuring to know that they are listening to you when they introduced the changes to the MPPF in 2000 and did away with 5-year land supply. I don't think anybody had really been to an inquiry who came up with that idea because they soon found out they needed that, and you always need that. But reassuring that they're doing that. Okay, with this new system then, what is the main intended improvement over the existing system?
Well, okay. I think, first of all, I suppose I'd characterise the new system as a positive evolution, frankly, rather than any sort of all-out revolution. And all of the changes are intended to be helpful improvements to the existing system that we have, the existing system that we all know and love so dearly. So, honestly, it's difficult to pick one, and in part, at least, that's because they all sort of work together in lots of ways. A lot of these changes don't sort of sit in isolation, but they actually sort of interact with other changes as well. So you're asking me to pick one, though. So perhaps arguably then, the main one, I would say, is the new requirement not to simply review your plan every 5 years as a local authority, but to actually update it every 5 years. On the face of it, that's a really small and perhaps sort of simple kind of tweak of language. But I think, as we all know, in planning, words are important. And actually, what that means will bring about quite a big change. So it kind of brings to life the concept of ongoing forward planning. So at the moment, as you all know, and maybe lots of people watching will know, we have the possibility of a local authority looking through its plan once every 5 years and simply confirming that it's all okay. Nothing to see here, chaps. Move on. No need for an update. Well, that can't happen in the reformed system, so far as I understand it, at least. Or that's the intention anyway. And the LURA includes sticks to make sure that updates do happen. Interventions and the like, and notably commissioners with wide-ranging powers as well. So I can understand why some might be sitting there sort of questioning the need for that, sitting there thinking, well, look, why should we have to update our plan every 5 years? It's a lot of work and it's a lot of expense. Honestly, yeah, I think that's probably right. It probably is a lot of work and a lot of expense. But, on the other hand, as was mentioned earlier, we have a plan-led system. And it seems to me that if we're serious about a plan-led system, then it's probably right, isn't it? That we should always be looking, thinking, and actually proactively planning ahead. I certainly think so anyway. And, things can change quite radically in a pretty short space of time, in a 5-year period, for example. So my view is that anything that we can do to make sure that plans are kept constantly up to date is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think, if I may say so, I think that's absolutely spot on. These self-determined reviews, frankly, they're not worth the paper they're written on. They have no evidential weight, in my view. If you just look at it and go, yeah, we're all fine, we'll carry on as we are, as if nothing had changed in the world ever. So, yeah, that's an interesting development then, and a very welcome one, I have to say, I think, for most people. To be fair, most local authorities don't go through that review process and pretend nothing's changed, to be fair to an awful lot of them. But those that do seem to think that's acceptable. Yes, Simon, you were going to say?
Yeah, just for the avoidance of doubt, I didn't say that any authorities do that. I just said the current system allows the possibility.
Absolutely, and I'm not putting words in your mouth. I'm just making an observation as somebody who plays on the same pitch. What I would also say then is, what is the new system going to look like? What are the main changes that we're going to notice in the new system?
Okay. Well, kind of allied to what I was just talking about, really, the more plan examinations, I think, is something that we will notice really rather soon. As I mentioned, the 5-year update requirement, assuming it's actually adhered to, will mean that the number of examinations we do will increase, I would guess, well, I haven't done the maths, but I would guess quite significantly. So I don't know if that's got to be good news for you barrister types, I should think. Will keep you even busier than you already are. So if things work out as planned, not just more examinations, but also shorter examinations. So I did want to sort of touch on this a bit. So for anyone watching that hasn't picked up on this, the intention is that in the reform system, that examinations would take 6 months. Now, that isn't actually set out in the LURA. I suspect it's highly unlikely as well to be set out in regulation, rather more likely to be a policy expectation, objective, aim, whatever you want to call it, something of that kind. That would be my strong suspicion. So whether that aim of achieving 6-month examinations is successful will probably depend, frankly, on a number of things, but including on how successful the proposed gateway process is, making sure that plans with significant soundness problems don't actually get to examination in the first place. And it might also, I can see another dependency here is probably around the rules on examination pauses. So the LURA does set out some provisions on pauses. So we know from the LURA that you will be able to have a pause, and that if during that pause, the local authority goes off and does what the inspectors asked, produced a new study, a new bit of work, a new bit of evidence, whatever it is, that's when you come back to examination. If the inspector considers that hasn't resolved the problem, then the LURA says the inspector must recommend withdrawal in that scenario. But there are still some question marks around all of that. So what I don't know, frankly, the LURA doesn't tell us, is whether or not you can have more than one pause. So if you have a pause, you do what you needed to, inspector's happy, you move on, inspector finds another problem, and there's a need for another pause. What I don't know at the moment is whether you can have a second pause to sort out a different problem, or whether you can't. So, and as well, there is a bit of a question mark about precisely how long pauses can be. So I think all of those things play into the question of how successful we might be in relation to achieving the aim of shorter examinations. So that's second thing. So third thing, I think that is, well, to me at least, from a PINS perspective, this is an interesting change, or something that I at least will notice, is that inspectors will be active, or very much, or at least anyway, a lot more active within the plan making stages. So that will be within the gateway process that I mentioned earlier. So this is something that was set out in the government's consultation. When was that? Early last year, was it? I've forgotten now. I've lost track. But anyway,
Last year,
yeah. Okay. So yeah, it was set out in that consultation. So it's likely, I think, that we will see the new system including a 3 gateway process. I think it was a 3 gateway process that was consulted on, and you are highly likely, I would suspect, to see inspectors giving advice to the local authority at gateway 2. Again, for any authority that doesn't know this, we do actually offer advice. We call them advisory visits to local planning authorities who are doing their plan making, and ask us to do an advisory visit for them. But I have to say, that's a very, very short, very limited exercise. But what's proposed here in the reform system is a frankly massive shift in terms of scale. Not least of all because it's mandatory. So, every local plan going towards examination will have to go through gateways 2 and 3 at the very least. So for us, because I'm talking about, main changes here for PINS, that will be a significant change, particularly in terms of our resourcing and how and where we deploy inspectors. And as well, also, you'll probably also see inspectors running gateway 3 as well. So, in effect, deciding whether or not the plan in front of them is ready for examination. So, that's something of a shift as well, really, moving away from, the current position that we have where the local planning authority has to consider whether the plan's sound, has to decide that it believes the plan to be sound before submitting. In the reform system, you'll be an inspector basically sort of doing that and considering whether the plan has a decent chance of being found sound at examination. So, at least I think that's sort of how it's meant to work. And I would say that there's still a bit of work to be done on that as yet.
Okay, well, that's fascinating, because what I take from that is a much more proactive system, with inspectors being much more proactive in the way that judges might manage cases. And as you say, more examinations and shorter examinations. Remains to be seen whether, in fact, we are going to have a lot more plans submitted, because we might see some councils unhappy with whatever changes might come and take place after the general election, but that we don't know. And I was going to ask you about when is all this going to happen, but of course with the announcement yesterday, we don't have the relevant schedule, so we don't know. And there's no point me asking you about the first wave of 10 or the subsequent wave of 25 authorities, because we don't know that either. So it's a great deal of unknown this stage at how it all progresses. But that's really, if I may say so, helpful, Simon, about outlining a much more proactive process, and I think everybody would welcome that. I am going to ask you this, though, which is that, we have a housing crisis in this country. That's not controversial. The planning minister announced that in 2013 in a parliamentary backbench debate, and that was Nick Bowles. And the crisis seems to be getting worse. So are local plans really working at all if the crisis just seems to get worse in housing?
Yeah. Well, a few things on that, and I suppose the first is to say that I recognise the point about there being a housing crisis in the country. First of all, I suppose I would say though that the premise of the question seems to be that local plans are sort of solely responsible for delivering new homes, and of course that they're not. That's not right. So clearly there are many factors that come into play when we're talking about housing delivery. Not least of all, financial and economic conditions, infrastructure delivery, to name a few. And I'm sure we could sort of, go through that list for most of the evening, well, certainly for the rest of the show. But, so as I see it, local plans in and of themselves aren't delivery vehicles. The presence of a local plan, even an up-to-date one, can't absolutely cast iron guarantee that houses will be built. But, it seems to me that, though, that local plans do have a very, very important job to do. They're essential to create the right conditions for new housing. And frankly, it wasn't in your question, but and other development as well, for that matter, to come forward. Plans are there to answer the big questions, solve the big problems that the borough or the district or whatever it is has, and to lay out a positive framework for new housing to come forward within. So even if we're just talking about new housing and not other development and all the other stuff, this isn't just about the amount. The government's aim is rather broader than that. It's also very much about it is very much about the amount, but it's also about the right type and the right places. So it's in the local plan, really, where these issues should be, and are resolved. And without them, it is frankly difficult to see how the overarching objective of achieving sustainable development can be achieved. And as I say, plans aren't just about housing. Of course, they're also a major plank for helping a whole raft of other stuff that's really important to the country, to local residents as well. So, they're absolutely vital for setting the right kind of framework for local economic conditions for businesses to start up, to grow and thrive, and also whole load of other stuff as well, like providing open spaces, protecting land that should be protected, and so on. So, so could plans be performing better? Well, probably. I have to say, I'm an inspector, so I like to think about the evidence, and I don't have any to hand. But I suspect a major issue lies around where there isn't an up-to-date plan. I don't have any figures immediately to hand. I think plan coverage is publicly available to look up out there. I haven't done that, but suffice to say, do you know what? Plan coverage is disappointingly low, and I would agree with anyone that says it needs to be better. And I think that's one reason why the reform system is very much looking to require that plans are updated rather than simply reviewed, so that you do get that ongoing cycle of plans being updated and brought forward. So what we don't know, of course, just to sort of finish up my response on this question, is where we'd be if there were no up-to-date plans in place. And I'm sort of struggling to see how planning by appeal would be more likely to tackle the housing crisis, or indeed to achieve the government's wider aims of getting the right type of homes in the right places.
Yeah. Well, I think we all agree a plan system is absolutely fundamental. And it isn't just patchy coverage, is it? It is also the timing. And are some of these plans arriving, 5, 10, 15 years too late? That's another issue. I guess really the answer lies in the political will to insist on plans. But we won't go there just now. I am desperate to ask you about what you enjoy about being an inspector, but I'm also very conscious of the time, and I've got 3 other people who are desperate to ask you a question. So I'm going to dive in. If we've got time for that question at the end, we will. But Mary, your question, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Simon, my question was about local plan examination inspectors and how they get trained and allocated. And also, I'm wondering why we don't have a system where, as a matter of practice, more than one local plan examination inspector is allocated. So, the burden is shared, if you like. So that's one theme. And I think another theme, if I'm allowed to, but another theme is trying to limit pointless examinations. And I think actually you've already answered that, because I think the answer to that is this new gateway system. And
I don't know what you mean, Mary, by a pointless examination.
But let's come back to, how do local plan examination inspectors get trained and allocated?
Yeah, okay. I think you're asking about the sort of practical kind of internal pins sort of thing. Yeah, okay. So in terms of training, we usually we use experienced, well-seasoned inspectors to do local plan work. I've never been overly enthused by the notion of plucking brand new inspectors and dropping them into local plan work, perhaps for obvious reasons. But if it's not obvious, it's because it's really difficult. It's really complex work, and it does take, in my view, a baseline knowledge of what the role of the inspector is, aside from anything else, let alone the sort of understanding of what an examination is, and what you need to do in that respect. So the starting point is that yes, we use experienced inspectors on local plans. So even though they are well seasoned, we nonetheless put them through a grueling training program, a local plans boot camp, which takes about a week, something of that order, to cover all aspects of doing a local plan examination, for all the sort of procedural stuff, which is really kind of different in local plans to, for example, appeals or frank, anything else that person is likely to have done before, through to looking at national policy around plan making and how that works, because that's not something that an appeal inspector ordinarily sort of has to grapple with. And I would say it's pretty intense. And if that weren't enough, we then, the training doesn't stop there, because the next step is on the job training, in effect. So, and this comes on to your point about panels, I think is what you were getting.
Yes.
So yeah, so having undergone this sort of initial the local plans training, that inspector wouldn't then be sort of dumped in it and left to sink or swim. We put them out with an experienced local plan inspector for their first examination as part of a panel. So yeah, and I think you were asking about why we don't run panels of inspectors on examinations more as a matter of course.
Yes, and I'm thinking to myself, why don't we have a transport specialist that can be deployed? Why don't we have a BNG specialist that can be deployed? Why don't we have a housing specialist and employments? Why isn't there a bit more of that going on? And I'm thinking maybe the gateway system will provide you with an opportunity for that. But
yeah, I think
it's maybe not. But
yeah, I mean, I suppose what I would say is that we do panels, and not just for the aforementioned sort of training purpose. So we do also do panels for very large, contentious or otherwise especially contentious plans, or where particularly difficult issues are likely to arise. So, I've worked in, I've examined a number of plans as part of a panel, for example. The difficulty that we have there, though, is, we have a responsibility to think about cost efficiency. No matter how you look at this, this is taxpayers' money that's paying for your inspector. It's the local authority that pays for the inspector time when examining a local plan, as many of you will already know.
Yeah.
So panels, i.e. more than one inspector, doesn't always equal better cost efficiency.
No.
Because that sometimes you can end up, if you're not very, very careful, in doubling up on inspector time, particularly on areas where both inspectors on the panel need to fully understand the points that are being made and the evidence as well. So to be perfectly honest, it is a difficult balance, but it's one that like I say, it's one that we do kind of consider very carefully when a plan lands on our desks.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you, Mary. Sasha, your question?
Back to you, Chris. Yes, Simon, I'd like to, obviously you're pretty experienced now, and I know you had the pleasure of Paul's company for some period of time in a previous examination. I mean, just give us a flavour. One of the things you can imagine we're often asked about by our clients and consultants is, how do we really, what's good practice as an examination? Now, can you just give our viewers an insight from your perspective, obviously? What do you like? What do you think is good practice for those preparing for an examination?
Yeah, okay. I think you mentioned consultants there in particular, but I think a number of the things that I would probably say in response to that applies more widely to, frankly, anybody who's engaging in the examination process. I think the first thing I would say is please get to the point, right? More words, whether written or spoken, does not equal more likely to be successful, right? So the inspector really needs to be able to understand very quickly what you think the soundness problem is, and what you think the best remedy for that problem might be. If you bang on too much, whether, verbally or in writing, there's a significant risk that the point you're trying to make can become completely lost. So that would be my number one tip. If you're a consultant, work, particularly if you're one promoting a proposed site in the plan, please, work with the council, help them, share all you possibly can with them, because time and time again, I've seen that not being the case, and you end up in a hearing scenario where the local authority officers are almost kind of deferring to the land promoters to answer my questions. And actually, do you know what? The local authority should be able to answer those questions. And so you, as a land promoter, need to help them be in that position. Pretty obvious, I suppose, the next thing I would say, but statements of common ground are always invaluable, always more than welcome, and really do help assist the inspector in narrowing down the issues. And in the context of a local plan examination where the number of issues involved are so numerous, that is just it's absolutely fantastic to see a statement of common ground. Frankly, it can make one's day. I suppose I would say as well, at hearings, for goodness sake, please behave, right? The vast majority of people do, but disruptive behaviour or an unhelpful, generally kind of unhelpful approach or demeanour isn't going to help the inspector understand your point. And frankly, do you know what? It isn't doing your point or frankly, your client any good at all. So, don't get into a row with local residents that have a different view to you. It's unbecoming and unnecessary. And overall, do you know what? Just do all you can to help the inspector, really. try if you can to put yourself in the inspector's shoes, even if it's only just for a moment. Can be quite a scary place, but go on, have a go. What is it that he or she needs to know from you? And try your best to tell them as fully as you can.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And then finally, Paul.
Thank you. Hello, Simon. Can I just ask a question which will have come across the mind, I suspect, of all of the barristers sitting in front of you, which is the extent to which the inspector examining the plan doesn't just see the hearing statement, but also has regard to all of the other evidence put forward at submission stage, which can sometimes be voluminous, but also can be sometimes quite a long distance in the past by the time you get to an examination hearing. So would you lift the veil and tell us the extent to which an inspector will be au fait with all that information, or do we just focus on the hearing statements?
Yeah, so I think your point, Paul, was about, where there's been quite a bit of time from the initial kind of submission of the plan to the hearings, because there's been like a lot of initial questions or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do you know what? That can happen. And the early part of the examination can kind of, become protracted where significant issues are identified by the inspector early doors. And do you know what? It can be really difficult, frankly, for the inspector, where you have that significant amount of time between them looking at the representations and then being sort of faced with hearing statements. And, so at that point, one of the things the inspector will have in his or her mind is whether or not anything's changed, whether that be on the ground or whether, arguments have changed for whatever reason. So going back to the previous question and giving people tips, if something has changed, well, please say so. Don't leave it till you rock up at the hearing, because the inspector needs to know about that as early as possible. And where there has been a kind of significant change in circumstances, then it might be that the inspector will need to ask for an updated topic paper from the council, or something of the sort, or indeed from any other kind of relevant party. And that stuff may well need to be the subject of consultation as well. But overall, I think the inspector's aim really will be to have everything all up to date and as clear as possible in his or her mind before going into the hearings. So, for me, I think that's vital, really, to avoid a scenario which I'm sure never happens, where an inspector turns up at a hearing to get completely fresh evidence and to find out that, the things that he or she has heard all about before have changed significantly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. And that brings the interview to an end. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. We're very grateful to you for your time. Lots of people will be listening to that on the podcast at the weekend and on YouTube as well. And really, really useful information as we go into yet another new system. Just to say to everybody, we will be back in 3 weeks' time, I think on the 13th of June, because there's something we need to fit round. It isn't a general election, but there's something else. And so we'll be back on the 13th of June. So just finally to thank you, Simon, for joining us. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.